Welcome to the webinar, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a very full house today. We have several thousand potential people on the line. So as Galen said, if there's issues, please let us know. And it should be smooth webinar, but you never know when there's going to be issues. So here you can see here on the slide in front of you that there is a webinar support email if you want to jot that down just in case you have issues. And before we get started with the webinar, just a few housekeeping. The slides are located, and if you look at your navigation bar, the slides are available to you in the handouts drop down, so you can download those and have a copy. And also, we are going to have a 30-minute Q&A panel session, and that will be after all of the presentations today. We're going to wait until the end of the webinar for the Q&A, but at any time during the webinar, you can ask a question of any of the presenters. So you'll see in your navigation bar, there is a questions drop down where you can type questions in the box there. And we also asked if anyone is attending with you in a room, if you could let us know, just to get an idea of how many people have joined us today. If there's just only more than one person in the room, if you could type that in the questions box, we'd really appreciate that. Okay, next slide, please. For those of you who requested certificates for this webinar, you need to be registered, or if you're in the room with someone, the person registered can provide your name in the questions box so we can get you that certificate. And you must attend for at least 60 minutes of the webinar. Next slide. And we have some upcoming webinars today. I'm not sure it's there we go. The water research webinar series, just to point these out to you in case you haven't seen these announcements. We do have a SARS-CoV-2 and wastewater monitoring webinar tomorrow and at the same time, and a tools and resources webinar on the 21st on our lead action plan research update. So feel free to click on those links and register for those webinars. And before I turn it over to our first speaker, just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our webinar website. So you can watch this recording later or share it with someone if you know they've missed this webinar. They're usually available within 2 weeks. And with that, I will go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Ben Packard. He is also with EPA's Office of Research and Development. Ben?
Hey, Michelle, can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michelle. So I'm Ben Packard with the EPA Office of Research and Development, and I'm a project officer working on the research grants program there, and I specifically work on water research grants. So last week, the National Interagency Fire Center showed that nationally there are currently 74 large fires that have burned 3.7 million acres this year. So I'm hoping that the timing of these presentations comes at a time when it's most helpful to folks. And I want to thank everybody for taking the time to log into the webinar here. As Michelle said, we've set aside a lot of time at the end of the webinar for Q&A, so definitely, by all means, if you have questions, please post those in the webinar chat. And so I wanted to quickly give you some background on the presentation today. So the last 7 years, EPA has received funding from Congress specifically to be used for extramural water research that's national in scope, and that's called the National Priorities Grant Program. So the grantees you'll hear from today, they received grants under the 2014 National Priorities Grant Program, and that was titled Systems-Based Strategies to Improve the Nation's Ability to Plan and Respond to Water Scarcity and Drought. So the overall goal of these grants were to get a better understanding of management options of how drought and climate change impact water quality and availability. And also they were looking at impacts to human and ecosystem health. And lastly, I just want to say that grants fall under the Safe and Sustainable Water Research Program. So that's one of 6 national research programs here in the Office of Research and Development. So next slide. So 4 institutions were awarded under this set of grants in 2015, but the 2 that you'll hear from are the 2 here on the slide, Clemson University and Water Research Foundation. In addition to these 2, Public Policy Institute of California and also University of Utah received grants under this. Next slide. So just very quickly, I wanted to give a very high-level overview for anyone not familiar with this topic. So generally, wildfires impact water quality because rain events that occur after a wildfire can transport suspended and dissolved materials in streams and rivers downstream, which creates downstream water quality issues. In some cases during wildfires, ash settles on lakes and reservoirs, but for the most part, post-wildfire precipitation is the cause for most of the water quality problems associated with wildfire. So some of the watershed factors that influence water quality are going to be vegetation. So vegetation will influence the level of sediment and contaminant runoff. So that depends on what type of vegetation is in the area. It also influences how quickly erosion will take place, because obviously loss of vegetation to a wildfire will lead to bank instability and erosion. Wildfires also reduce the amount of water taken up by plants, which further increases the amount of surface runoff that could increase due to the wildfire. Fire intensity is another factor. So higher intensity fires caused by elevated levels of fuel. So essentially, more dead vegetation can cause increased levels of runoff. And that's due to dramatic changes to the forest vegetation structure and also soil conditions. And also it relates to how quickly the vegetation can recover after the wildfire. So topography, in addition to fire intensity, will play a role. So for example, steeper watersheds, depending on the soil, might experience increased sediment loading following a wildfire. And then as far as hydrologic factors, wildfires can change, and in many cases, increase flows and alter essentially the watershed's ability to process precipitation. So the highly variable nature of wildfire behavior combined with complex patterns of vegetation, landscape, and hydrologic and other factors contribute to a large level of uncertainty surrounding what water quality effects will be after a wildfire. So some of the general impacts from wildfires include flooding and erosion. So volumes can result in flooding, erosion, and can alter the physical characteristics of streams and rivers. Ecosystems can be harmed. Obviously, aquatic life can be changed. So food webs and fish spawning grounds can be changed. Water quality, lastly, this is what the presentations today are focusing on. Drinking water supplies for communities downstream have to deal with water quality impacts given greater sediment, nutrient, and contaminant export to surface water bodies. So having said that, communities receiving water in fire-prone areas need to develop and operate efficient drinking water systems to treat higher sediment and nutrients. So the first presentation is going to focus on the wildfire aspect. So they're looking at high and low severity wildfires and impacts on water quality. And then the second presentation will address decision support for drinking water utilities impacted by wildfires. So having said that, I want to again thank everyone for registering and attending the webinar. And just again, if you have questions, we have plenty of time at the end. So please send questions during the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Michelle.
Great, thanks, Ben. Just a reminder for people who may have joined after we first got started, we are having the Q&A panel, as you may have seen at registration, at the last 30 minutes, and we will hold all questions to the end of all presentations. And at any point during the webinar, you feel free to type a question in the questions box, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible today. We will also provide the presenters with any questions that you submit, because we do have over 2,000 people on the line, and so we won't be able to get to every question. So we'll provide those to the presenters so they can follow up, and you also have their contact information here. Okay, with that, we'll get started. I'd like to introduce the first presenter, Dr. Alex Chow. Dr. Chow is a professor of biogeochemistry in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation, with a joint appointment in the Department of Environmental Engineering and Earth Science at Clemson University. And I'd also like to introduce Tanju Karanfil. Dr. Karanfil is a professor of environmental engineering at the Department of Environmental Engineering and Earth Science, and is also the president of research at Clemson University. Tanju will not be presenting in this first presentation, but he will be on the Q&A panel at the end to help answer questions related to this topic. And with that, Alex, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to get started.
Okay, yeah. So let me see.
We can see your slides.
Okay. You see which screen you're seeing right now? Do I need to switch it?
Yeah, you need to switch.
Okay, so it's good, right?
Go. And do you have your webcam?
Oh, okay, thank you. Let me see how to turn on my webcam. You see it now?
Great. Yep. You're good.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining the EPA Small System webinar series today. My name is Alex Chow. Dr. Karanfil and I are the PI of the EPA project funded in 2015. So the objective of these studies were mainly on the field reduction technique, including the prescribed fire and mechanical thinning on the water quality and treatment. In parallel, we also systematically examined some wildfire occurred during our study. Today, I will focus on the results of the disinfection byproduct influenced by the low-severity prescribed fire and high-severity wildfire. Okay. Well, let's see. Okay. First, let's look at the relationship between forest and our drinking water. Forest land comprises near 800 million acres, representing 33% of total land area of the US. About 53% of the water supply in the US is surrounded by the forest land. Forest is supplying drinking water over 60 million of people in the US, including the large cities like Los Angeles, Denver, and Atlanta. Our drinking water quality depends on the water continuums. Rainwater is captured by forest watershed and exchanged into the rivers. Alternatively, we withdraw source water for treatment before delivered to our home. Any watershed perturbation could deteriorate water quality. Wildfire is one of these. As illustrated in this animation, wildfire consume the biomass and convert them to ash. Post-fire erosion could flush a lot of ashes into source water. It will be a great challenge for water utility to manage this situation. Each year, on average, more than 60,000 fires occur. An average of 7 million acres are burned each year. 7 million acres is the equivalent to the size of Maryland. As of September 1st, 2020, near 40,000 wildfires have been burned over 4 million acres this year. And many of these fires occur near the water supplies. What can we do to protect this source water? First, we need to understand the cause of a wildfire. Forest detritus such as foliar litter and grass laying on the ground is easy to burn, especially when they are dry. It is analogous to light a fire in a fireplace. You need a fire lighter to burn the woods. Thicker of the detritus layer, the greater the risk of creating high intensity of wildfire. In forestry, we consider this forest litter is considered a fuel. Detritus is also a major source. Detritus is also a major terrestrial source of tea color-like dissolved organic matter. Although DOM is not a contaminant, it poses a number of water treatment challenges, such as increasing chemical demands, fouling membrane and activated carbon, serving as organic source for biological growth, and also the formation of disinfection byproduct. Thicker of this detritus layer, greater amount of DOM could be exported. In water engineering, we consider this a source of DBP precursors. So as we see, thicker the forest layer can cause wildfire and the DOM in source water. If we can have a management practice to reduce this layer, it could be reduce the wildfire and also improve drinking water quality. Prescribed fires is a forest management practice. Fire is set intentionally to eliminate the detritus layer. It is one of the few reduction techniques to reduce the risk of wildfire. As a water quality concern, if we can reduce the biomass, such as foliar litter and duff, it should be reduce the NOM export from a watershed, and eventually it could reduce the DBP precursor in source water. To test this hypothesis, we conduct field experiments. The photo here were taken in a prescribed fire in South Carolina. It is a low-severity control fire. Fire generally consume the top detritus materials. There's no impact on tree or underlying materials. To evaluate the effect of prescribed fire on water, we look at the treatability of prescribed fire on divided DOM, dynamic of DBP precursor in post-fire runoff, and also look at the long-term effect of prescribed fire practice. First, we cooperate with South Carolina Department of Natural Resources to conduct pilot study in Yankee Wildlife Center in Georgetown, South Carolina. Each plot was about 1 hectare. The video on the left showing a forestry technician start a prescribed fire using a drip torch. Before and after the fire treatment, we collect the biomass or ash from the forest floor. 1 kilogram of this material wrapped in the aluminum screen and then put in a tray. The bottom of each tray has an outflow. It was connected to a glass cardboard. The tray was placed in an open field for a year. Water sample collect next day after any rain. These are These are 15 trays representing empty control, unmanaged sites, peak burn condition, dormant season burn in the February, and growing season burn in May. The results of this study were summarized in the box model right here. So the first column lists the 4 treatment: unmanaged, managed before burn, burn in winter time, and burn in the summertime. The second column shows field survey on a biomass in the forest floor. In this model, we simply consider 2 compartments: the large woody biomass and detritus layer. The detritus layer here means like grass, foliar litter, and decomposed stuff. We see there was no significant difference in woody biomass because prescribed fire generally does not consume the large woody materials. For the detritus materials, the unmanaged site had the thickest layer, 4 times higher than the pre-burn sites. The 2 unburned sites had the least detritus material per unit area. The next box is showing the average of the dissolved organic carbon and DBP after 1 year of prescribed study, the field study. The unmanaged forest substrate have the highest DOC concentration and export the most carbon. And since the higher DOC concentration, higher THM and HA formation were observed in this treatment. Excuse me. And slightly higher DOC, slightly lower DOC and DPP formation were observed in the 2 burned sites when compared to the unburned sites here. Remember, each tray contains 1 kilogram of forest substrate. So the higher DOC in the unmanaged site may be related to the humidification process or the from the detritus layer. We also look at the water treatability using aluminum and ferric coagulant, and we don't see there was no difference on DOC, THM, HAA, and SUVA reductions. So the results show here, the low intensity fire reduced the organic mass, but without change the reactivity of the organic matters. To further test our hypothesis, we work with US Forest Service to conduct watershed scale investigation. We select a pair watershed, watershed 77 and watershed 80 in Francis Marion National Park in South Carolina. Watershed 77 have been managed mainly with prescribed fire since 1960. It burned 2 to 4 year cycle. Watershed 80 is a reference watershed that has been left unmanaged since 1960. Both watersheds are first order with similar area 160 hectares. Water quality parameter, including DOC, have been monitored since 2005, which provide a really good data for long-term comparison. And since the size of the watershed is relatively large, the prescribed fire in this study was applied using aerial ignition. Helicopter dropped the ping pong ball-sized bomb from above. The entire watershed was burned within a day. Result of the DOC concentration are shown in the figures here. The red triangle is the DOC from the grab sample. The black line right here are concentration detected by the DOC sensor, recording every 15 minutes. The fire was happened in mid-April. The data can be grouped into the 3 sessions, before burn, post-fire burn, the rainstorm, and few months after. We're generally talking about like 4 months in each period. And in this, the post-fire runoff, there are 4 major rainstorms. And the figure right here showing the average of the DOC concentration from the DOC sensors. On average, higher DOC concentration were observed in the first 3 rainstorms. And in other time, that's the unmanaged have a higher DOC. Also, we observed the first one have the highest DOC concentration compared to 2 and 4 storm. If you look at the average doing statistics, there are no difference in terms 2 to 4. So you may also supply the concentration of DOC system in our system is really high, with average about like 20 to 30. But in coastal South Carolina, it is a black water system. The tea color water DOM is really common here. Let's look at the THM formation. We group again in this one with before burn, after burn, and post-fire rainstorm. Before we discuss the fire effect, we need to recognize there's a seasonal factor. Considering the non-burn site watershed 80, the green one, you see there's a seasonal factor change the THM formation potential. So therefore, to evaluate the effect of the fire, we need to compare burn and non-burn site in the same time. When we look at the average, the triangle on this figure, the higher THM FP was always observed in the non-burn site. But when you look at the significant difference, it only happened before and after burns in this period. Next, when we look at the yield of THM per unit carbon, there will be no difference between burn and unburned managed watershed, suggesting the prescribed fire did not change DOC reactivity in forming THM. Also, you see there's a significant drop in THM for the yield in the summertime. Different reactivity in suggesting that could be a different carbon source. Especially in the summer, higher temperature promotes microbial activity, which can affect the DOC and THM formation in the fall. Let's look at the HAA formation. Higher formation potential were observed in the first post runoff and also in the fall. Look at the trihalomethane, the haloacetic acid yield per unit carbon. The greater HAA formation were frequently observed in the burned watershed, but the increase when you compare the seasonal difference is relatively small. So overall, the HAA formation was still lower in burned watershed because it was offset by the lower DPP, the DOC concentration. So the next figure here is the long-term DOC concentration of both watersheds since 2005. This data was collected by flow proportion auto-sampler. DOC in burned watershed is about 16 and unburned is about 23. Results showing this repeatedly burning can reduce DOC concentration in source water. Also, another important measure from this data is about the seasonal variation. Within a year, excluding the outlier, the DOC still can jumping up and down for over 30 ppm or greater. And seasonal variation may have even greater impact than DOC concentration than the prescribed burn practice. In the last slide, we illustrate the DOC concentration in managed watershed is lower, but this field reduction technique not only change DOC concentration, but they can also change hydrology. As shown in the figure on the left, the discharge of the managed watershed 77 was larger than the watershed 80. The increase of the water export could relate to the reduction in evapotranspiration. So you see the discharge from this manager is higher. To determine the overall DOC carbon export, we do a simple calculation times the DOC load by concentration times the discharge. And you will see that the concentration in the red line here is most of the time is lower than the unmanaged watershed. But except the one section here, the wet one is higher. At this period, the DOC higher because there's a mechanical thinning. Results of this watershed study demonstrate that the importance of watershed management on source water quality. It could affect both water quantity and water quality. Prescribed fire management could increase in water export, but decrease DOC load from a watershed. It could benefit downstream water utility. So let's revisit our hypothesis here. If we can reduce the substrate in forest floor, we can reduce the NOM in source water and eventually reduce DPP precursor. We create box model to illustrate the effect of prescribed fire. So this manager 77 and unmanaged watershed. This data shown here is 1 year after the prescribed fire. So prescribed fire do not, because we know the fire do not change the woody biomass, so we exclude in this model. Instead, we try to separate the litter mass and duff layer. And we see the duff layer was almost reduced by half. And then we can see a lower DOC concentration and also lower THM and haloacetyl formation in this watershed. Okay. Because the prescribed fire study was conducted in South Carolina with high DOC system, someone may question how if this prescribed fire can also apply in Western US like California. Well, first, our study in South Carolina is a proof concept showing the benefit of prescribed fire on water quality. We also work with UC Berkeley Sage Creek Field Station to examine the prescribed fire on water quality. The video here showing a pile fire is one of another technique used in California. Watershed scale pile was burned in 2018 and 19. We have the sample downstream for water monthly about a year. Preliminary analysis show no impact on the water quality. So let's recapture everything from the prescribed burn. Treatability on the prescribed fire, greater DOC and DPP formation from the unburned material. After you burn, there's no difference. It suggests there's no change on reactivity. And in terms of the DOC, slightly higher, but it only happened in the post-fire runoff, and no difference in THM formation, and slightly higher THA was observed. But in the long run, prescribed fire increasing water yield and also lower DOC and DPP precursor in source water. And we have published this data in a water research and an international journal of wildlife of these 3 studies. So in the second part, I will present the result of our wildfire study. The photo here are taken at 2013 Rim Fire in California, which was the 3rd largest wildfire in that time. In this high severity wildfire, as shown in this photo, most of the above ground and below ground biomass has been consumed, and only ashes were left on this bare soil. To understand the impact of wildfire, so we will look at the treatability of wildfire divided DOM, dynamic of DPP precursor in the post runoff, and also we have a chance to look at the wildfire at a previous burn site. I will give you more detail later on this part. So to evaluate the wildfire divided DOM, we collect the ash material for a control laboratory study. 2 commonly folio litter in California, Ponderosa pine and white fir, were also collected from unburned forest as a reference. DOM were extracted with rainwater in the laboratory. Results were summarized in this table. The first 2 columns are fir and pine. There were 2 types of ashes here, black ashes and white ashes. White ash is generally an indicator high intensity fire. And DOC and DON were expressed in milligram per gram of materials. Higher DOC and DON per unit biomass were observed in the foliar litter than the ash materials. On the other hand, when you look at the SUVA, higher SUVA were observed in the burn sample, suggesting a higher aromaticity. Importantly, DOC from the unburned sample have about 50% or greater removal efficiency when you treat with alum. But when you compare the burn sample, the lower efficiency observed. Even the particularly in the SUVA, the removal efficiency is only 20%. Results show here that burn residue reach less DOM, but they could be more difficult to treat. To understand the impact of wildfire on source water, we conduct a field investigation on 2 wildfires in Northern California in 2015. One is called Rocky Fire, which burned about 400 square kilometers. Greater than 50% of the burn are considered high severity burn. The water sampling point was in the blue dots right here. Consider the entire watershed. The burn area was about 20% of it. The second one is named Red Fire, which burned about 33 square kilometers. It's also a severe fire. Greater than 70% of the area is high severity burn. The blue dot here is the water sampling point. We also collect sample from the non-burn site as a reference. Let's take a more close look on the water sampling point here. It drains the first order watershed, mainly from the fish watershed, and consider that is 80% of this watershed was burned. Fire occurred in summer, but there's no water flow in the intermediate stream until early January. With support from the Professor Randy Dahlgren at UC Davis, we were able to collect water sample from the first floods, even within 2 hours after the initial flush right here. The video showing that the sample we collecting and including a lot of ash and settlement, and you can see it contaminated downstream waters. For this study, we collect water sample for 2 wet seasons. Here's the hydrograph, and the blue dot is our sampling time. And you may need to pay attention about the second water year. You can see this in much more precipitation. The water flow in this year is higher than the first year. The diagram on the left here is the dynamic of DOC carbon in the first year, 2015 and 2016 water years. Water from wreck fire, the square have the west square have the highest DOC concentration in the post-fire runoff. The rocky fire and non-burn site have lower, similar DOC concentration. Remember, rocky fire only burn 20%, and the wreck fire is 80% burn, suggesting the burn extent could be also a factor on the water quality. In the second period, in March, concentration of DOC from all these sites behaved the same, and gradually over time, no difference was found. In fact, the highest DOC concentration were found as the highest total suspended solid were recorded. So when we checked on the SUVA, a higher SUVA was also observed in that time. So we suggest from this, the higher SUA and DOC, we are suggesting the ash material contributed DOC in the water. We also collect water for second years, but when you compare it, there are no significant difference. Look at the THM, FP, and HA for these three sites, and you can see for first year, THM is higher and HA is higher, and no difference was observed in the second year. And then if you look at the close look on the THM and HA for the wreck fire, and you see most of the DOC are higher at the beginning. But another message from these figures, you can see the color here is brominated species. And the bromide is showing on the bottom here. And it's showing that higher brominated species can be found right after the fire. We believe the fire retardant or burned vegetation and soil in this coastal environment may contribute the bromide. Now let's look at the wildfire in previous burn site. This study was not planned at the beginning, but we have the opportunity to extend the pre-burn site in California, which is similar to a prescribed fire. In 2014, there's a fire called Mendocino, burned about 26 square kilometer. Is considered a moderate to high severe fire. In 2015, there's wreck fire. It's a south of that fire. It's about, we just discussed in the last few slides. In 2016, there was coal fire, burned about 16 square kilometer above this wreck fire. And large area, as you see right here, is overlapped the 2014 fire. And as you see the severity fire map, is considered as a relatively low severity fire. This coincidence gives us the opportunity to evaluate the impact of wildfire and a site have been previously burned. So in the severity fire, THM and HAAP was higher compared to the reference sites, but in the low severity fire, there's no difference in terms of the THM and HAA. This unplanned study may support the idea of prescribed fire can reduce the risk of wildfire and also minimize the impact on source water quality. To sum up what we saw from the wildfire, so in the area we investigate, DOM was more reactive in forming THM and HAA. DOM have a lower removal efficiency, and increasing DOC and DPP in the first post-fire runoff, increasing brominated DPPs was observed in the first run, post-fire runoff. And if a site had been burned before, we don't see a difference in DOC and DPP formation from this non-burned site. And some of this paper have been published in the Water Research Journal. Our team has studied the impact of wildfire on soil and water quality and published in a peer-reviewed journal. And so the blue funnel here are specific for wildfire on water treatability. So in addition, based on the result of our publication, we also create 2 animated videos to illustrate the effect of wildfire and prescribed fire on drinking water quality. This video is, for using a layman term, is particularly good outreach material for general public to understand the relationship of wildfire and water treatability. And last, I want to thank you, the US EPA, to provide this support, and also our collaborator, US Forest Service, Department of Natural Resources, and also the Randy Dorgan, and also the Pacific Lab, Environmental Molecular Science Laboratory for this molecular study on that. Thank you. So I think that's we'll go to the next speaker. So I will turn it back to Michelle.
Thanks, Alex. I just realized I was on mute. Thank you for that presentation. Before we move on to the next presenters, just a reminder for everyone, I know we have a lot of questions coming in. On your navigation bar, feel free to ask. We have 2 more presenters coming up, so feel free to ask questions at any point during the webinar, and we'll get to those during the panel discussion at the end. And with that, I am not sure what happened to the slides there, but with that, I'll go ahead and introduce the next speakers. We have Dr. Joseph Kaslich. Sorry, Joe, if I pronounced your last name incorrectly. And Fernando Rosero Ortiz. Joe is an associate professor in the Civil, Environmental, and Architectural Engineering Department at the University of Colorado Boulder. And Fernando is a professor of environmental engineering and the director of the environmental engineering program at the University of Colorado Boulder. They are both going to tag team this presentation, and at the end of both of their talks, we're going to go ahead and then move into the panel discussion. So Fernando, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you, Michelle, and good afternoon, everyone. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My apologies, my webcam is not currently working, so you'll hear my voice without being able to see the image. So today we're going to talk about some of the work. Let's see. There we go. We're going to talk some of the work that we did on the grant held by the Water Research Foundation and the University of Colorado Boulder. I'll acknowledge the other folks that participated in the project: Kenan Osikin from the Water Research Foundation, Balaji, Professor Kaspricek, Livnet, and Summers, and I, who are at the University of Colorado Boulder. Next slide. As Professor Shao mentioned, and something that we've seen a lot in the last few weeks, is the fact that we have a lot of wildfires burning. And the reality is major US cities are dependent on surface drinking water, which originate from the same forested watersheds, which are currently under threat of wildfire. Next slide. What this means for our water supply is that when you have a wildfire in these spots that also serve as a source of potable water, we can deal with issues related to an increase in sediments, nutrients, and heavy metals. For example, it's been well characterized before that you can have sedimentation events or sediment mobilization that result in turbidity that is hundreds of NTUs, something that most drinking water utilities will not be able to handle. There's also a lot of work on nutrients related to nitrate, and potential issues downstream with algae blooms, also mobilization of heavy metals, mercury, for example. In terms of water quality, we observe degradation of water quality by taste and odor, for example. It's not uncommon to have issues now with your surface water with that smoky odor coming from the wildfire, and color, and then decreased lifespan of reservoirs as you have a lot of turbidity moving in and settling. Next slide. What our work done is we searched to integrate changes that happens in the watershed, how those changes impact water quality, and how that water quality is now impacting water treatment facilities. For example, we have a publication cited here where we talked about decision support systems for water treatment, specifically looking at how to handle extreme events. Next slide. What I want to do is start by providing a little bit of context to our work. And for example, we used the case study of Fort Collins, a mid-sized city serving 133,000 people, and that draws water from 2 main sources, the Cashlaputa River and the Horsetooth Reservoir. And in 2012, next slide, the High Park Fire burned roughly 90,000 acres just west of Fort Collins. At that time, the 3rd largest wildfire in state history. And more importantly, when this wildfire hit, it essentially hit right in the lower reaches of the watershed. So here's a map showing the watershed. The fire at that point was essentially as you exited the canyon, right next to the intake to the drinking water facility. Now, any of you that are coming from a drinking water, that are working in a drinking water facility, is so much stressful to all of a sudden see your intake to the river being taken out by the fact that you have a major wildfire around you. In the case of Fort Collins, they were able to swap to the Forster's Reservoir, which had enough water, and essentially they could bypass the river for the time needed to be able to go back to normal water quality. Meanwhile, at CU Boulder, some of us were studying that same watershed, and I'd like to acknowledge here Amanda Honer, currently a professor at Washington State University, who led a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about here in a second. So we went in and we were able to study this system to essentially trying to understand the changes in water quality after that wildfire. What we did was we compared water quality at a reference site unburned. As a side note, that reference site that was unburned in 2012 is now burned. There's currently another fire in the same region that essentially burned our reference site, but back then it served as our unburned control. And we also look at the water quality at the intake and essentially looking to isolate the impact of the fire. And the way we do that is essentially, for example, we can have on a burn site a turbidity of 2.1, in the reference site being the control site, a turbidity of 1, and then we essentially look at pairwise differences to essentially assess the effect of the fire on water quality. And on the next line, we have essentially that analysis done for different water quality parameters: turbidity, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and TOC. And what you see here is in the years prior to the fire happened in 2012, the turbidity, for example, there wasn't a lot of difference between the impacted site downstream and the upstream side. The same thing for nutrients. In the case of TOC, which is something that we worry about a lot because it's also not only important water quality parameter, but it's also a driver for disinfection byproduct formation potential, we did observe a move towards higher DOC in the intake side. And on the next slide, we also looked at, for example, the impacts on treatability. For example, coagulation. We did run a lot of samples similar to where Professor Shao looked, but we essentially came up with the conclusion that that enhanced mobilization of TOC and turbidity will result in higher coagulant costs. For example, in this study, for example, we observed an average increase in alum dose of about 10 milligrams per liter. We also looked at high levels of disinfection byproducts, and ever since we've done a lot of work understanding the actual effect of temperature on disinfection byproduct formation potential yield. And that is some of the work that we've published elsewhere. Before I move on and let Professor Kasprice carry on with the second part of our project, I also wanted to emphasize that there's been an area of recent interest in the wildfire world about the potential for chemical contamination after a wildfire. There are studies from utilities in the West Coast when, for example, benzene has been detected after a wildfire in an urban environment. And we've actually done some additional work on this area where we've actually evaluated the presence of other organic compounds present after a wildfire, including compounds such as benzoic acid derivatives, pyridines, etc., and compounds that we found not only in simulated samples, but also in field samples. And I have a reference there to a publication that came out this year where we're starting to look more into not only the bulk issues related to turbidity, nutrients, and TOC, but also more in the chemical level regarding potential contaminations. And with that, I will let Professor Kasprice take it over.
Thank you so much, Fernando. Let me just get myself situated here. Okay. So one of the cool things about the funding that we got from the EPA program was that we were able to, look at this problem again in a holistic sort of way, where we were really trying to combine a couple of different aspects of this whole sort of system. One of the things that we did that we won't talk about today is that we did some sediment transport modeling of looking at how the mobility of sediments in the watersheds sort of affects this whole problem. We also did some statistical work that looks at different levels of water quality within water treatment plants that we also have published on, and all of them are available in the Water Research Foundation report that we generated at the end of this project. What I do want to talk about today is basically dovetailing with what Fernando was talking about and thinking about how can we generalize this and think about how the water treatment plant would respond if they were in a situation where they needed to treat this water. So, you know, in Fort Collins' case, they were sort of lucky because they had that extra water source that they could use. Whereas here, it would be, how can we actually respond to such events if there are cases where there is not an extra water source and we end up having to treat the water? And so my former PhD student, Dr. Billy Rosman, who is now working at Hazen and Sawyer, did a series of studies that basically look at how to create decision support systems for water treatment plants. These types of decision support systems are often used for reservoir management and more sort of water quantity studies, where you're looking at sort of how to allocate water across distribution systems or reservoir systems or what have you. But there are some unique challenges on trying to take those types of technologies and use them in water treatment plants. And so there's a series of studies that we tried to link here, and the kind of main study that I'm going to be talking about is listed here on the lower right-hand corner, which looks at this multi-objective optimization of water treatment operations for disinfection byproduct control. So the idea behind using simulation and then optimization that's coupled with it is this idea that we're really trying to stress test different management strategies and looking at multiple water quality scenarios as you go along. And there are kind of two major goals for thinking about a management strategy. The first is to avoid these disinfection byproducts. I violated the webinar rules by answering some of the questions in the questioning, but a lot of these acronyms that you've heard the other speakers talking about are these different disinfection byproducts that we are trying to model and control for human health reasons and that kind of thing. But, there's also cost limitations. So, you want to make sure that you're not going to break the bank in doing these kind of management strategies. So in doing that, simulation allows you to look at, dozens or hundreds of different possibilities for different influent water quality and then how the treatment plant would respond. And what I want to do is I want to walk through a schematic of what that looks like, and then we have a few references if you want more information along the way. So years ago in the University of Colorado with Scott Summers and a team of people, they created this water treatment plant model, which is called the WTP model. And the idea behind this model is that it was looking at how to help the EPA with regulatory considerations. In other words, water treatment plants would essentially respond to new regulations, and then you could see what these different output variables would be. And so, when we look at models, we think of things as in inputs and outputs, right? And so the idea behind the model is a way for you in your office, sort of in the comfort of your own air-conditioned place, to look at different raw water quality scenarios, as well as different configurations of a treatment train, some basic calculations of water quality within distribution systems, and then chemical doses. And so the idea being that you can respond to different influent water qualities by changing chemical doses. And so, all of these on the left-hand side, are inputs, but the one highlighted in purple is highlighted in purple for the reason that that is going to feed into this decision support optimization that we're going to talk about in a minute. And so this model allows you to play a what if game to say, if I have different incoming water quality, how can I essentially respond? And then what is the output going to be? So if we look on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see different outputs. So finished water quality, as well as water quality estimates along different parts of the treatment system. as well as estimate of disinfection byproducts, as well as chemicals used. So one of the things that you'll notice in this is that there are different ways to sort of structure your decision variables. And when we did this paper, we really wanted to try to make it somewhat general so that people could kind of see how to use tools like this. And I know that there's some other treatment models out of Europe and that kind of thing that you could kind of organize yourself in a way to actually look at these inputs and outputs. So in other words, sometimes the chemicals used could be considered a decision variable, but here we have a different sort of set point logic that we're using so that the amount of chemicals that we're using are actually an output, and you'll see how that works in a minute. Okay, and so for those of you who are familiar with modeling, you can kind of see this situation that the model is a tool that allows you to try to change the inputs and basically see how that affects the outputs. But also for those of you who have used models, you can tell that this is a frustrating process sometimes, because you can imagine that there are dozens or hundreds or thousands of different combinations of these inputs that you can try. And so my area of expertise is in a simulation optimization framework, which essentially augments this model with a technology that allows you to try many different combinations of these inputs and maximize objective functions that are created based on the model outputs. And so that's how we sort of change the loop here. And you'll notice that the top part of the loop is basically the same, but now we're adding in a new technology. And so the technology is called a multi-objective evolutionary algorithm. And to be honest, there's a lot of details about this technology, but what I want to focus on is sort of how this technology is used to sort of affect decision making, and then you can kind of dive into the details of it, and contact me if you want more information. And so really the goal of the MOEA, and I'll be using that acronym for the rest of the time, is to essentially suggest different decisions, okay? And then it takes objectives and constraints that are calculated based on these outputs, and it is trying to maximize or minimize the objectives and make sure that the constraints of all these different solutions are maintained. In other words, that a solution is feasible if it meets all the constraints, okay? Now, a little bit more about the MOEA before I move on. The multi-objective word within the MOEA means that it balances different competing objectives, okay? And so I've already kind of talked broadly about these two objectives, cost and disinfection byproduct formation. You can think about objectives like if you go to the car dealer and you're trying to find a car that has all-wheel drive and a sunroof and the maximum horsepower, you can think about things in your life as objectives and constraints. If I don't want to pay a lot of money, if I only have a budget limit that I want to accomplish and I only want to spend $25,000 or less, that can be a constraint. If I want to maximize the amount of horsepower in my car, that's an objective because I care about the value of the number that I'm trying to maximize or minimize. So multi-objective basically means that it can balance these objectives all at the same time. And then evolutionary algorithm, this is very similar to the term genetic algorithm, which you may have heard. And the idea behind that is that it takes a population of these points and essentially combines good features of those points, just like in a population of organisms in the environment. You have deer, or you have whatever, they're combining with each other. And then basically the child generation has better qualities than the parent generation. And so it does this mathematically under the hood. And it does that essentially, again, to have the decisions become better and better based on how the objectives and the constraints are defined. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of step through the different parts of this process and sort of show you some of the results from a case study that we did that was based on Fort Collins. Okay, so the first part is the operating policies which are input into the model. And so really the big job of an analyst or an engineer here is to essentially set up what this problem formulation looks like. And I will talk briefly in a little bit about how this set point terminology works. The idea being that you want to control different water quality parameters within the treatment train, and you essentially have an algorithm that tells you how much chemical to use to achieve those different set points. So then for the outputs of the model, what you do is you take these outputs of the model and then you transform them into objectives and constraints. And as I said before, objectives, you care about the value. So if I want to maximize a number, then you care, you know, if you want to maximize something, then 13 is better than 12 is better than 10 and so forth. Versus a constraint where you don't care about the value of the number other than the fact that it is higher or lower than a value that you specify. Okay, so for objectives, we're looking at cost overall, and we're looking at disinfection byproduct formation. And so for the cost, what we're doing is we're basically using proxies for this that have to do with parts of the treatment process themselves. So in other words, instead of having to worry about the unit cost of each one of the chemicals, for example, you're basically just saying, if I'm minimizing the amount of chemical that I'm using, you know, you can think of cost as a linear function of chemicals. And then the objectives are basically done, both the objectives and constraints are done associated with EPA regulations on disinfection byproduct control. And so what we do here is sometimes we're playing around with this idea that the regulations will be a running average, for example, but we are looking at multiple different scenarios of water quality. And so we can use a kind of min-max sort of approach and say that if I try to maximize, or sorry, if I try to minimize the worst performing scenario as far as disinfection byproducts, then everything else will at least be better than that. And so that is a kind of way to add some level of kind of risk involved here because you're looking at multiple scenarios of water quality. So these are the objectives, and you'll see sort of what the output of all this looks like in a minute. And then I have constraints. And so the constraints here are more traditionally related to the way that the regulation is actually written. And so we have different quarters of the year that we're looking at, and then we're basically creating a function that basically looks at the annual average of the DBPs for each quarter. And we want to make sure that any policy that we have in this trade-off analysis is going to meet that threshold, which is really good because that means that any point that you're looking at within this plot that I'm going to show you later is valid because none of them are going to, violate the regulation. And as I said, this mimicking of evolution is done in order to identify the best operating policies. So a policy is a set of values for these decisions, and then all the policies meet all the constraints, and then they have different values of these cost objectives and the DBP objectives. Okay, now there's a couple of other moving pieces associated with this that I want to talk about before we look at the results. The first one is this idea of the water quality scenarios. And this can be challenging because there are a number of different water quality parameters that you want to simulate, and they all have relationships to one another. So in other words, in order to kind of create new stress test data for this process, it can be somewhat complicated. And so we actually developed one of our publications was actually, it looks like I actually don't have the citation on here, but you can look this up and I can provide the citation later to a publication that we actually had on this topic. And so the idea behind stochastic time series analysis is that you want to take a set of observed data and you want to create plausible new sets of data that mimic the properties of the first of the observed record, but kind of have different variations and sort of different temporal patterns so that you can kind of see into the future what what possibilities are going to come down the line. And so for those of you who are fans of statistics, this is sort of a fun statistical problem. And for those of you who are not, we sort of figured this out and you can use it. So it's all good there. But the idea behind this is that you want to take the observed record and you want to capture different time series statistics of that observed record. So things like the median and the variance, seasonality, and you'll see that in our results. autocorrelation, which is basically the property of a time series to be correlated with itself. So in other words, like if it's raining today, it's likely to rain tomorrow. If it's clear today and you're in Colorado, it's likely to rain tomorrow, right? and then of course the different correlation among the different water quality variables. And so what we ended up having here then is you basically create this nearest neighbor resampling technique that resamples values in the observed data and adds random variation to them. So going back to the Kretsch-Laputer data set, we were able to create 2,500 different realizations of these water quality parameters that use this monthly simulation based on the data that we have. Okay, and so you can see what the data looks like, and you can see that strong seasonality, that pattern of up and down that you see throughout the season. Or, we were able to create simulations that basically matched those types of properties. And that's important because it allows you to go beyond just looking at what happened in the past. You can kind of perturb things and take a look at a wider selection of different possibilities of what could happen in the future, which is really important for planning purposes. And this is used a lot in water resources studies, and we're trying to take this into the kind of water quality planning that we're talking about. And so, like I said, I apologize for not having the citation for this paper, but we can provide it for you. So once we do that, then we want to go back into the water treatment plant model and talk about the decisions and the constraints quickly. And so this diagram basically shows how that set point logic works within the treatment plant. And so there's a pretty conventional treatment plant train that is used in this paper, partly because it is indicative of what is going on in Fort Collins and a majority of the regions in the United States. And so the idea here is that you basically have set points of different water quality parameters at different points in the treatment train, and that becomes your decision variable. Okay, so in other words, give me enough chemical essentially to have a certain amount of pH and alkalinity at the early part of the train, and then also looking at set points that are at the end of the system. And what this allows you to do, which is kind of nice, is that it separates the decision variable logic from having to worry about what the actual incoming water quality parameters are. In other words, you can basically set these set points to be as risk averse or not as you want, and then basically the model will then show you, given that you have these set points, what are the likely water quality outcomes of making that decision. And again, this allows you then to sample a lot of different possibilities and really learn something about how to better manage the system given the incoming water quality. Decision support systems often get a bad rap that it's something that it's supposed to tell you exactly what to do. And sometimes for certain things that works out. But what this really is allowing you to do is to learn more about the way that you do your system and to learn essentially how your chemical doses might change based on incoming water quality scenarios. So for the constraints, as I said, you can see the table here on the slide. They are modeling the drinking water regulations. And so the idea behind this is that we are running a simulation that basically is looking at these 4 different quarters of the year, and we can actually calculate a running average of the last 4 quarters as a way for us to simulate the way that the regulations are basically calculated. And again, remember that because these constraints are in here, all of the solutions that we're going to show you have met these values for the regulations. And so then the question is sort of what is the DBP risk beyond that, and how can the chemical doses change, and so forth. Now, the last thing that we need to do before we get into the results is think about how these results are to be displayed. And so it turns out that there is a big challenge, because you can kind of imagine that if I have multiple decision variables, multiple objectives, there's a lot of different moving pieces, and it can be hard, first of all, to just visualize all of it. And it would require people, you already have to be kind of an expert in a number of different topics. I've talked about statistics, I've talked about math. And, a lot of the times people can't also do a lot of multivariate data analysis. And so what Billy did in his PhD is he actually developed a visualization library that we were calling Parasol. And what Parasol allows you to do is, with very minimal coding, basically set up, this kind of cookbook of different commands that are run within a web browser, and then it allows you to create a dashboard that you can look at with these visualizations in a very easy way. In fact, there's going to be a link later in the presentation where you can actually look at these yourself, and it's also provided in the paper. And so some of the features of this library are that it is a web application. So if you're sharing it with somebody, they just need to use a browser. And there's really nothing for this particular part. There's nothing special about the fact that it was developed for water treatment plants. It can be used for other environmental or even just regular management problems where you have multivariate data. And then one of the other pieces is that the larger that the data set is, the more that interactivity is an important part of it. And so this is all based on this idea that you can interact with the data, sort of move the variables around, do filtering of the data and so forth. This is provided in one of the last citations that I'll show you, which was published in Environmental Modeling and Software. Okay, and so let's take a quick look at the results, and then we're going to wrap up pretty quick here. So the results look something like this. Okay, so let's kind of step through this one at a time. These are what are called parallel coordinate plots. And the way that a parallel coordinate plot works is, instead of having a regular plot that is a scatter plot where the axes are perpendicular to one another, you basically take one of those axes and essentially push it on its side. So now an individual solution is no longer a point in that space, but rather a polyline that's connected between these different axes. And so if we take a look, there are objectives and there are decisions. So let's start with the objectives. The preferred direction for each one of these objectives is down at towards the bottom of the screen. So in other words, if you were able to meet all of your objectives perfectly, there would just be a straight line at the bottom of the plot on the top part, and it wouldn't really be interesting, and we could all go home because there would be no trade-off among these different objectives. However, as I've already kind of talked to you about, the the solids, the lime, and the carbon dioxide are going to conflict with the disinfection byproduct objectives, which are the first two, TTHM and AJA5, such that, I mean, it makes intuitive sense, because you have to basically spend money in order for you to get better performance associated with the DBPs. And so you can see the blue and the orange lines that are highlighted in the darker color on the top basically represent a trade-off. So the blue line uses more solids, which is bad. That's kind of, or relates to more solids, which is bad because it'll cost more money, versus, but it has the best performance with HAA5, versus the orange solution, which shows you that if you have fewer solids, then you're going to end up having higher HAA5. But again, these all do meet the regulation. Okay, so like that's what the objectives look like, and that's why we talk about these as far as trade-offs, because you can't kind of have your cake and eat it too. It's going to cost more money essentially to have better engineering performance. Now, the decisions don't necessarily have the same kind of thing. So in other words, lower or higher isn't automatically better. Just look for the decisions as the magnitudes. And so the cool thing that you can see on the bottom is essentially how the decisions change for the different quarters of the year. So in other words, what this is showing is that you can set these set points essentially at different parts of at different values for different times of the year, and then get the results that are shown on the top. And what the interactive example shows, which you can pull up in your browser, is that you can take these axes and you can switch them around, and you can filter on them. So you can basically, give me all of the answers where the HAA5 is less than 0.05, for example, and you can really use that to kind of play around with this. And any one of these points ends up being, a plausible solution to your problem. The other thing that happens is you'll notice that there are different colors that are shown here. And so what this basically uses is a statistical technique called k-means clustering. And what that allows you to do is just look at similar, similar values for the different solutions. And so the three different colors are kind of like three different groups. And so what we did in the rest of the paper is we just looked at the kind of statistical properties of these solutions. So the word Pareto solutions on the screen basically means the Pareto optimal trade-off solutions, the solutions that you just showed here. And then Billy actually took individual solutions and looked further at their properties. But you could see that what this allows you to do is it allows you to show different kinds of groups of solutions that have similar properties. So going from blue to green to orange is lowest DBP risk to higher and higher DBP risk. And then you can sort of see how the decisions change throughout the year. And generally speaking, like what the distribution of the different set points actually looks like. And so what this kind of shows you, for example, is that the blue solutions, which cost more, but they do very well, end up changing the decision pattern throughout the year versus orange solutions that don't really change the decision pattern over the year. And what this kind of shows you is that in order to best manage the system, you need to take into account that seasonality, which is so prevalent in the Fort Collins data. This is going to look different depending on what system that you're solving it for. But this is just an example of some of the insights that you can get by running this simulation and optimization loop together. And so with that, I just want to wrap up. I want to acknowledge the EPA Office of Research and Development, the grant program, as well as the generous support from the Water Research Foundation, Kanan Ozakin, who is the project manager from the Water Research Foundation side. And then just to quickly acknowledge Fernando, of course, you already heard from, but Scott Summers, who worked with us on a lot of the treatment stuff, Balaji Rajagopalan, who collaborated on the statistical aspects of the work, and then Ben Livna, who was leading the sediment transport work that we were doing within this project. Also, there was a suite of different graduate students that were on the project, and they're listed here. You heard about some of them, and of course, this was really the PhD of Billy Rosman, who I wanted to acknowledge. Thank you so much for your time, and happy to participate in the question and answer. Thank you.